Okay, now you can proceed. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do a call to order. I'd like to do a roll call, please. I'm
Okay.
here, Joe Durick.
One issue we will have, but we should note on the front end, is Callan is the secretary. So we will need someone to take notes. Any volunteers?
I'll take the
I'm
notes.
happy to tag. Oh,
Okay, no, you want to take them, that'd be great.
I was going to suggest a tag team. Two brains put together might have a decent amount of reliability.
Yes, ma'am.
All right,
That was
well,
Angie, right?
Yes.
since I can actually see everybody, I can complete the roll call if you like. So we have Joe Durick is here, Angie Bandy,
Here.
Elizabeth Baker,
Here.
Kathy Corley. Kathy, you're muted.
Yes, he is.
My connection is not stable, so
Okay,
I turned off my camera.
gotcha. Okay, we'll count that as a here. And Callan Pearson is absent. Okay, Joe?
Okay, the next one will be the approval of meetings, and this is the meetings from the February the 2nd, is that correct?
I believe so.
Yeah, because we didn't have one in March, so I've got the meetings in front of me. So do we have approval of those meetings? Everybody say yes, or?
I move to approve the minutes from the February 2nd meeting.
I'm sorry, you broke up, I'm sorry.
I move to approve the meeting minutes from February 2nd.
Okay, everybody say yes?
Hold on a second, we'll need a second.
I will second
Okay.
that motion.
Okay, Angie seconds, and since we are on Zoom, everything requires a roll call vote. So I'll do that if you would like. So we have a motion, a second to approve the minutes. All those in favor would be Joe Durick,
Yes.
Elizabeth Baker,
Yes.
Angie Bandy,
Yes.
and Kathy Corley.
Yes.
Okay. Back to you, Joe.
Yes. Dan, how do you want to do the discussion of the policy review for sections 1 through 4? How do you want to handle that?
We can just kind of roll through. There's not a lot on the front end. When we get back into 3 and 4, there's more. But out of the gate, I would just like to know if you guys had time to review them with your experience and all, if you noted any issues before we get into the things that we have notes to cover.
I would just like to include, while we're looking at it, specifically starting off in section 1, as we identify that the town will not discriminate, that we take the opportunity to include the gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. I believe it was 2008, there was the genetic
Information, I think it is word.
Yes. And pregnancy, unless you wanted to cover that under the perceived disability. But anyway, we've just have an opportunity to update that.
Okay.
And that was in section 1, is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Under B, the personnel policy statement was the first time I believe it is mentioned. B1, employment and placement.
It's actually in the paragraph above that under A, the last sentence as well.
Okay.
And I don't know that you really need it to be both places. If you have an overarching anti-discrimination policy, then you shouldn't have to mention anti-discrimination over and over again throughout the rest of your handbook.
In certain specific sections, are you recommending?
It's actually mentioned again in C. So maybe we can just see if we can combine some of those, and we may have to add some inclusive language about inclusiveness. But I think we can do that.
And I think if it is like in the beginning sentences under B would be like the proper placement for that. It starts it out, it sets the stage, and then it doesn't need to be mentioned over and over again, like Kathy said.
Okay.
The EEOC has some guidance about crafting your anti-discrimination policy. I pulled it up. Boyd, would it help to send you a copy of that EEOC guidance?
Sure, that'd be great.
That way you can have some sample wording. Okay, I can send it. If I can be, I have it. Should I just send the link through the email, like replying to the email for this meeting?
That will be fine.
Okay, great.
I'm sure I can find my way to it. That would be helpful. And I think also in the first and second sections, some of this will be addressed after thinking through it some more, that with the pay study, comp study that we have initiated, some of this stuff may change in sections 1 and 2 based on how that evolves. So we can kind of hold some of that till later and see how that pans out. A couple of the things, is that the only thing you guys noted?
I have, it's recommended that there is a statement about at-will employment at the beginning of an employment or this type of policy. To also include that this policy is not to be construed as a commitment or contract of employment, because typically they have to sign something at the end. It was just something that I had seen that was recommended to include in the municipal personnel.
I think there is a statement like that at the end of, actually at the very end of the policy. but it might not be a bad idea to move that to the front.
Yeah.
Okay.
It also
So
might
you
fit nicely under section 5, employment.
Yeah, it was back a little ways. I don't know, and everything that I'd seen and read, it was like in the first couple sections of, was in the first section in the first couple subsections.
Okay. One of the, and even in section 3, when we get into the compensation plan, well, hold on just a second. I lost my, we got 2 different documents with notes on it here. Yeah, in section 3, E, it's under hourly rates, and I'm not sure that this has ever been done exactly the way it kind of sounds here. Employees paid on an hourly rate basis are paid for actual time worked. The town council will set by resolution all salaries paid by the town through the compensation pay plan. It talks about hourly rate but then it refers to it also as salaries. And I don't know that any of those have ever been set by resolution. They're basically discussed and approved during the budget process, which is actually an ordinance. And if there are changes in the compensation plan, that's pretty much handled the same way through the budget process. If the years that we've done like a 5% adjustment to the plan itself, that's addressed during the budget process and approved, and then the associated impacts to the budget are incorporated into the budget, and then that's approved again through 2 readings of an ordinance. So I'm just wondering if in that situation, just removing the by resolution and changing salaries to wages would really accomplish what we're trying to do, and saying that the town council has to approve these. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Because there are adjustments through the year that are made, but the council doesn't approve all of those. If someone changes positions or hits a milestone or whatever, and the funds are budgeted and available, then those things can be done. So I mean, this just sounds a lot more restrictive than I think it was intended to be. And again, I don't know that it's ever worked that way. Any thoughts or objections or anything there?
Just that if it's never worked that way, it shouldn't be written in your policy, in the policy.
Okay.
And the way I'm reading this as well is that employees who are hourly are paid for actual time work. So that's no lunch breaks and no, or other breaks? Or is that built in?
Well, that varies from department to department. Primarily fire and police are paid during their lunch periods because they cannot be fully relieved of duty. They're subject to have to get up and leave. They don't have the ability to use that time as they wish. So fire and police are compensated for meal time, and others are not.
Okay, so that does read correctly.
Okay.
Can I back up for a minute? Because one thing that I had noticed was like probably in around section 2, maybe. And I could be mistaken. I did not get totally to the back of this, so it might be in here, in this policy. And I just haven't gotten to it yet, about 30 pages from the end. But is there a hiring procedure in this policy dealing with like the procedural aspects of promoting within? I mean, I saw some of the stuff about promoting within, but like specific to hiring, that seems to be a highly recommended section in a personnel policy, is to know, like kind of what that is and what that expectation is.
There are
I mean, I had read a little bit like down where the nepotism is, which I think might be not.
And yeah, I guess in section 5.
Okay.
It talks about
I did see what's in 5, and I guess like to my knowledge, there's a little bit more of a hiring policy typically in there, as far as like one common recommendation in Tennessee is that there in writing there is like for management or for like a certain position and above, there's a certain procedure for hiring, which is people that are again, this is just the suggestion that they use, people that are being looked at as an internal hire go up against those for external hire, but they get like extra points in the rating system as the application process goes on. The thought being that in the management positions should be looked at both as internal and external hires. It's just a thought.
I'm accustomed to seeing, there might be a posting procedure where you post a position for a certain number of days prior to advertising it externally, but not necessarily would you give extra points to your internal candidates. It really kind of depends on, really with most organizations, what you want to do is make sure that you have the very best candidate who is able to complete, the tasks and the responsibilities of the job. And whether that's an internal person or an external person, you just want the best person to do the job. you do want to make sure that your internal people feel like they've been dealt with fairly. And so sometimes that means posting a position for a few days in advance of advertising it to make sure that every single internal person who might be interested in a position is aware of the vacancy and has an opportunity to apply just like any any external candidate would. What you don't want to have happen is that you advertise something externally, you very quickly hire somebody, and you have an internal candidate who feels like they didn't have any opportunity to express interest in the position. And so,
And to kind of have that procedure spelled out in policy gives confidence to current employees, I believe. So.
But it does look like all of that sort of stuff is in section 5. And
yeah,
are we gonna?
I don't think we're getting to section 5 today, so I will table this conversation until we get there. How's that? Fair enough?
Yeah, and again, my, I guess, goal, as much as anything, was just to kind of get this process started and kind of hit some of these early things, and especially since Callan can't be with us, just kind of get a feel for how we want to work through these, and after the meetings, then we'll go back and try to adjust language and address the issues that we discuss, and then bring that back to you guys at the next meeting, and then maybe pick up the next section and go from there. So really, this was just hopefully this sounds going to sound terrible, but hopefully a relatively short meeting to kind of get that process started and get us some points to start working on, and then as we kind of get a little more comfortable with it, maybe we can bite off bigger pieces.
We can take 2 steps back. I do just have a question. Section 3F, minimum wages. It differentiates between full-time, part-time, and initial employees. And I was just wondering what an initial employee is.
That is another, basically I think the terminology take the place.
Did he freeze on everybody?
You froze.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
He'll be thrilled with the way this
I
went.
know, he was really good what he was saying too.
Sometimes Boyd really thinks things through.
He's thinking super hard.
And I would like to hear what he finished saying, but that was one of the notes I had, is that there's like in certain sections, there's a little bit of terminology and definitions, but there isn't like a policy-wide definition sheet, which was also something that was commonly recommended. And I would be happy to send that on, like what I found on, so that they don't need to rewrite.
Am I back?
You are.
Yes.
You're back.
Inquiring minds want to know.
I'm on a hotel Wi-Fi, so not making any promises. I think what I was saying was, when I froze, was that term kind of took the place of probationary, but ultimately kind of along the lines of more focus on being an at-will employer and there being no employment rights associated with the position, then that's really not in play either. That makes sense?
Real quick, Boyd, one thing that I shared with you I noticed that there are some definitions in certain sections, but there isn't an overall terminology or definition sheet with the policy. It's kind of best practices. I'd be happy to send over what I have from some of the work that I've done in the past on that, and that might clear up some of this, like what does this mean? What does this mean?
All right. Yeah, in section 4, 5, in section 5C,
Yeah,
initial employee, an initial employee is a new hire or an existing employee in a new position. Such employee's job performance will be assessed for a period of 6 months by supervisors by determining his or his good fit. And again, during this time, the employee may be terminated without the right of appeal, except in the case of alleged discrimination. And
which I mean, I like I said, I know that there are definitions throughout, but if you're using the terminology before the definition, that's not necessarily a great way of doing it. So maybe move the definitions to the front.
So if I'm first hired, I'm not full-time nor part-time. I'm just, for the first 90 days, I'm just,
well, this for 6 months. And then again, we don't really use that classification because again, for the entirety of your employment, those things can happen, except for the without the right of appeal. In some instances, well, actually, that just says termination.
So
and technically, there's no appeal of termination within our organization. If someone wanted to appeal that, they would have to file a claim.
So is there another section where it talks about, is there a probation period for new hires?
That I don't recall. I think that, again, that was the intent of that section or that terminology or term, but if the feel was that if you have a probationary period, which basically says you can be fired for cause or without cause or whatever, then once you get through that, some employment rights or other privileges attach, and that's not the case. If we are a true at-will employer, that scenario carries through.
I think a lot of organizations look at it as you have an initial period where people are learning the job. And so you want to provide feedback about job performance and make sure that you're meeting the employee's needs and that, you know, they're learning about the responsibilities and they have lots of opportunity to ask questions and so on. And so at 6 months, it's a good practice to sit down and talk to an employee and make sure that everybody's, you know, both the employer and the employee are on the same page. So, you know, I think that's kind of taken the place of that whole probationary period. And after you pass through that, you end up with additional you know, rights that really don't exist in the state of Tennessee or any other employment at will state.
But I think Elizabeth's right in what we do end up, whatever, you know, in this case, it's listed under types of employees, but in effect, they really are definitions. And as we go through this and we identify those things, that maybe there is a section at the very beginning that covers all of those. And then they can be referenced.
I've started making a little list. I'd be happy to keep track of those as we go through this.
I'm sorry.
Like, as I've been reading through this, I've been pulling some of them out, like what would need to be defined, or, you know, like the title that would need to be defined, or a term that would need to be defined. I'd be happy to keep track of that as we go through this, if you would like. So it's not all on you and Sam, and then I can bring it to the next meeting as we go on through the sections.
Okay. For some reason, I'm having a hard time hearing Elizabeth more than some others. I don't know if I'm the only one, but Sam was nodding his head.
I thought I understood that you said you're gonna keep track of what needs to be defined, and that you could.
It is the first time I have ever been told that I'm being too quiet, so I'll try to speak up.
No, it's almost like it's breaking up a little bit.
Oh, okay.
No, it's not. That's not it. Yeah, that would be great.
I like that idea, Elizabeth. If you're gonna put some things down, what about like it mentions FSLA.
Yes, I have that on.
Find the original reference where it says Fair Labor Standards Act.
Yes, I have that pulled out. Like I said, I've got about, in the first 4 sections, I've got about 17 highlighted already. And after this meeting, I'll just email them to everybody so they have them for the next meeting. And then if there's some things that aren't relevant to have a definition, or if the definition isn't up to par, then it can be changed at that point.
Great.
Can I make a comment? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah, I've got a problem with the initial employee, because the way it's written there is that a new hire or an existing employee, and then if the existing employee gets the job, leaves his other job, then he could be terminated without the right of appeal. So would that discourage people from moving to a new position that they may not be good at and don't know it at the time, and they could be terminated like as if they were a new employee? It seems we could word it a little bit differently in that, because a lot of people may not want to get and try for a new position if they know that they're going to be treated like a new employee rather than somebody who's been there for a while, reference to termination.
Yeah, I think we have an issue with that section as a whole.
Yes.
I mean, again, realistically, that is the case. You know, the way, and I believe it actually goes into the charter. The way if I were to delegate the ability to hire or fire to department heads, for instance, then there might be the opportunity for an appeal. But as it is, and I think all prior managers have held that responsibility. So the department heads, whether it's a hire or a promotion, they go through the processes. They write up a memo, give it to me, I review it and approve it. Generally, pretty much the same thing happens on terminations, unless it's a scenario that I've gotten directly involved in. So, but ultimately, I am the one who has to make the call and make the determination and terminate the employee. So then there is no mechanism for an appeal, and it's specifically laid out that way. And the council is specifically excluded from having that role. So, you know, our form of government is probably the most prevalent in the state, and it works that way by design. But that is if you wanted to look at it that way, it is a downside in that the person in my position is the one that has to make that call, and then there's no one to appeal to, unless it's an legal issue, discrimination, anything like that. You can file a claim or a suit. And luckily, I think we've handled things well in that for the last 7 or 8 years, we haven't had one of those. So, but it's a long answer to a short question, but I think that's one reason that section as a whole is a problem, because there's never really a right to appeal. Does anybody else have anything in that neighborhood? Okay. One thing we will need to change, if and it's possible, that the recommendation from Burris Thompson may differ from what we currently use. But in section 3B, it talks about the plan consisting of a minimum, maximum, and mid-range pay rates. That was changed several years ago, when actually not long after I took the position, and we were trying to stop the bleed on employees, and went to the minimum and what we call P1 and P2, and then market with a plan to move people through those fairly quickly, so that we get folks up to market in a more competitive wage and have a better chance at keeping them. But they're looking at that. It is kind of a hybrid system where you have steps, and then once you hit market, then that changes. So they're looking at that, and may recommend some tweaks. But just to have it on the radar, we either need to change that, what we currently have, or see what their recommendation is and the council decides to do there. So just wanted to mention it, because one way or the other it needs to change.
And Boyd, while we're there, it currently reads composition.
Yes.
Yeah. You think?
And I'm not sure that, yeah, it's the compensation plan, but I think that's referring to how it's put together and the things. So I think composition there may be a better word, but I think that is actually what they're getting at, is the composition of the plan, the composition of the compensation plan. One thing I wanted to ask about, and it would be nice at times if there was more flexibility, but we generally have some, but in the use of salary ranges, both 1 and 2, see if you had any thoughts there. Salary ranges are intended to furnish administrative flexibility in recognizing individual differences among positions, allocations to the same class, and to provide employee incentives. Minimum rate established for a class is the normal hiring rate, except, and in this case, that's a big word. And it goes on to talk about that. And that is one thing that is different too in the current plan, the way we administer it. Most positions, minimum is where you would hire in unless you have at least 3 years of like experience. Very closely related. Even with fire department, that has to be 3 years of full-time professional service. So you can hire in at P1 if you have 3 years experience. In public safety, where you're required to have certifications, if you also have those certifications, you can hire in at P2. If you're certified or you have 3 years experience, you can hire in at P1. If you have both, you can hire in at P2. And then on the anniversary of those, with acceptable performance, you move to the next step. So if we continue there, the question is, do we need to spell all that out in this section? I think I saw Kathy nod. That was it. Any other thoughts? Is it?
I kind of think like if you know how you're going to do something, then it should be spelled out because that limits the risk of somebody misunderstanding something and then becoming a problem down the road. So that's my thought, and that's the way that I've practiced personnel policy writing in the past.
I mean, I think it is good and important to have a statement similar to what's there that does provide some latitude and flexibility. But I think instead of just saying the minimum rate established for a class is normal hiring rate, we get into far more detail on how that works if we remain with that system. Okay.
Yeah, somewhere there's a careful balance between, giving enough information that employees feel well informed and putting too much in where you limit your flexibility and you've really turned it into a procedural manual instead of a policy manual. So
Yeah.
Policy versus procedures, little changes in procedures don't need to have policy changes. So you don't want to put too much detail where you have to, every time you change a single procedure, rewrite your whole policy manual. So
I agree.
So you got to kind of strike that balance carefully.
We'll work on that one. I think we have a couple others that we made. One of the, something I didn't get a chance to look at, you guys asked about the meal times being compensated, and it does vary by department. Along those lines, something else that varies. Now, the fire department is just, Sam, don't take offense from your prior life, but it's just strange creature. There, the hours, the shifts, it is going to always be completely different. But the police department is far more consistent with the other departments, except that they run 3 shifts a day instead of just 1. And again, the fact that they're compensated for their mealtime is really kind of a FLSA scenario in that they can't be fully relieved of duty. So they are compensated for it. But one thing that also is different for them is that you're allowed to, I won't say make, but that's basically what it is. You're allowed to make police officers work 43 hours a week before overtime kicks in. There's nothing that says you have to do that. So just wanted to perhaps get your thoughts on if we're looking at ways, if we're looking at compensation, down the road benefits, we're always looking at ways to keep good people. If that might be something you think we should consider in changing that to 40 instead of 43 and put them, you know, we pay them for their meal break, but that doesn't even add up to 3 hours a week. And I don't know. I think ultimately it'd be a relatively minimal cost. And it's something we could look at, but you know, when you talk about what they make, and you're changing $15 an hour to $22 an hour, it for a few hours here and there, I think it's relatively low cost and may have a big impact on perceptions and morale.
Yeah, you're looking at the max would be what, 3 hours of time and a half, just the little half portion that goes above.
You're looking at an hour and a half worth of pay a week.
Yeah,
max.
per employee.
Right.
Yeah. So that's
But
a tiny
that's
little.
if everybody worked it all the time. And some things we already pay that way.
Yeah.
For special events and some grant work, it automatically goes into overtime. So, Dan?
Technically, I don't know if you can call on me. Would anyone else like to hear a citizen's opinion? I'm not really supposed to speak unless I'm asked to speak. May I speak? As a citizen, as a volunteer who works for this town, the number one thing that I have heard that continues is this is this 3 hour policy. It's, I hope, all I want to say is please, it just makes sense to do this. It's silly to not do it, in my opinion, as a citizen only. So I'm done.
Thank you. And I do think the fire department section needs to be updated as well. But I will nail down those details and bring them next time around with the other changes. And I kind of skipped ahead because I wanted to make sure and touch on that one. But in the section above that, number one, under overtime pay, it talks about callback, and that if you're called in, you'll get a minimum of 2 hours and all that. We also have a situation, also over the years, a kind of a department that's seems to have function a little differently than most is the water department. And since we have a new director, he and I have really kind of identified some things that have been done for years. And I don't think that they're necessarily bad. We just need to make sure they're aligned and are covered. So in the water department, in this situation, if you're on call, we've had 2 employees who get like $20.50 per week for on-call time, just for being on call. And then if they are called in, then they get the 2-hour minimum and all of that. And in this instance, most all employees are subject to being called back in. That's the nature of the job, public works, fire, police. So that's always a possibility. But in this case, they are specifically assigned as the people who have to be available and respond within a certain period of time if a water main break happens or if there's an emergency, turn on or turn off, whatever. So again, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad policy, but it's not in policy. So I wanted to bring that one up as well. Adam has actually suggested and requested that instead of having 2 people on call, because apparently that amount has been in place forever, that he would prefer to have 1 person on call and combine those 2 to basically a $41 a week, and then it would rotate so that the people at that level, every 3 weeks or so, they would get that additional on-call time. And during that period of time, they have to make sure they're available and ready to respond and all that. But it's not a constant ongoing situation where, you can't just run out to Hamilton Place or go to a movie or whatever. So everybody takes a turn at it. And since it is specific to that department and they have to have that on an ongoing basis, I think it makes sense, and we probably ought to add that into the policy. Any thoughts or suggestions?
That's the only department that has on-call outside of first responders. Does public works, like on cold nights, do they have an on-call person? Like if they have to go out and like salt roads, I'm sure they do so much, and I'm taking the easy example. But do any other departments have on-call type of situation?
Public Works does, but it's generally the Public Works Director and the Streets and Sanitation Supervisor. In their salary positions, and it's
okay.
It's kind of that falls more in the line of there are fire and police on duty all the time, but the fire chief and the police chief are subject to being called at any time. With the water utility, it's more of an operational level response that the guys that work the lines and can, one, live close by, can respond and get out, identify the problem, and call whoever else they need. So they're all subject to being called in. These are just the ones that on an ongoing basis will be the on-call person.
Yeah. Okay.
For initial response. And I can talk to Loretta about that a little more to make sure there's not going to be a rift, for lack of a better term, that we make sure the departments are treated equitably. Okay. I think the last thing, because we're coming up on an hour, and I'm happy to stick around as long as you guys want, but one I wanted to be sure and cover, really the last one I have, and it's probably something we may want to just give some thought to, under that same section, E, out of rank pay. When an employee is required by the town government to temporarily work in a different position with higher rank and status, the employee will be compensated at the higher rank rate. At a rate pay will only last for the duration. That sounds pretty straightforward, but it's not. One question is, how temporary is temporary? And do we need to really address specific positions? Now, something that comes to mind, probably the easiest examples would be engineers for fire department. If a lieutenant is out on vacation, then senior engineer on the shift is the shift supervisor. But that's part of the duties of that position. Now that we have two stations, we have an engineer who is the only one in the building. The lieutenant is at station one. He is in charge of both stations, but we actually have an engineer as the senior officer all the time at the new station. So that situation needs to be addressed. And then we had a similar situation with our training captain, who's a salary position. He is out, will be out for an extended period of time. We have an engineer who's very good and adept at training and many of the skills that the captain has, but we can't put him in that position on a 40-hour week like the captain. He needs to work his shift, but we also need him to do some of the training duties. So basically what we came up with was assigning, I think we ended up at 16 additional hours a week. And when we looked at the training captain's rate and everything, it was basically going to be very close to what the engineer would make as an overtime rate. So really, instead of separating out and trying to qualify different rates, we authorized 16 hours at his overtime rate, which is right at about the same thing. So all of that to say, again, when you read that, it makes perfect sense and it seems pretty straightforward, but there's circumstances that it doesn't really take into account. So with what was said earlier in mind, and trying to balance enough information and detail while not getting overly complicated, I think that's something we may want to address. That I promise you that all made sense in my head. I don't know if it did once it came out my mouth, but those are the just kind of examples of some of the things that we deal with, and we probably need to get a little more information here or a little more guidance on how we want to handle. Again, appreciate flexibility and latitude, but I think in this case, it needs a little more attention.
Boyd, in the job descriptions for some of these positions, does it specifically say that he or she would assume duties or responsibilities in the absence of whoever the higher officer is?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's like the same situation with the police lieutenant and police sergeant. If some days they're both there, lieutenant's off days, the sergeant's in charge by virtue of rank structure. If that transitions to a longer term scenario, does compensation need to be considered? And I'll get the wording on the sergeant and the engineer. Shoot that to you and see exactly what it says in those job descriptions. And they all have the catch-all and any other duties as assigned type of language. So technically we could point to that, but I don't think that's where we want to go. I think if people step up and do the job, we need to treat them fairly. That hit the main points that I had listed, like I said, again, primarily in this section 4. Anybody else have anything they want me to work on for next month? Oh, I think it's covered somewhere else, but I'm glad I just remembered this. Another interesting scenario just came up. When you talk about, the hourly rate is paid for hours actually worked. And for instance, if you take a vacation day early in the week, and then at the end of the week, you end up having to work an extra shift, or part of an extra shift, those extra hours are going to be at straight time instead of time and a half because you haven't worked 40 hours. And that's the norm. This past weekend, staff was off on Good Friday, one of our holidays. So fire and police personnel, anybody that had to work on Good Friday, basically get double time and a half. They get 8 hours of holiday pay, which everybody gets. Most of us get the day off and get paid for it. So they get 8 hours of holiday pay, and if they work that day, they get time and a half. Per the policy. So the guys in the water department were off on Good Friday because it was a paid holiday. But then they got called in and spent most of the day on Easter Sunday working a water main break. And by policy, they're just going to get paid straight time for coming in and working all day on Easter. Thoughts? Can I go first? Since nobody else wants to. I just have a problem with that. I think there should be, and again, you got to balance it, but there's nothing in here that says I have the latitude in situations like that to just do what is right. I don't know if we try to address special situations like that, or if we build something in that allows me to take it into consideration. But
And Boyd, I agree with you. I would like to look into like what some of that language would look like, and how it affects. I mean, like once the idea is there, you can kind of see how it affects the whole organization, and that sort of thing. But I don't disagree with you at all. But I don't have an easy say, oh, we should just do this.
right. And that's the difficulty of this position. Sometimes it's you really are in a position to need to do that, but if you don't have the authority, you don't. And I've pretty much neck and neck run, making sure I do what's right by the employees and making sure I don't overstep my bounds. And sometimes you get stuck betwixt those two. And we have, a similar, and I'll have to double check in here. I think we have adjusted it, but you get into kind of the same scenario. Theoretically, it could happen on a lot of the holidays, because in this case, our actual holiday is Good Friday, because that's a work week for almost everybody or work day for almost everybody in town. But you could run into the same situation where, Christmas falls on a Sunday and we observe Christmas Eve on Saturday, or on Friday, and we observe Christmas on Monday. So those are the two holidays, our observed holidays, but then somebody could get called in on the actual holiday. In that instance, fire and police, their overtime is based on what day the actual holiday is. Everybody else gets paid for the observed holiday. So again, water department could be off on Friday because that's when we observe Christmas Eve, and then get called in to work all day actually on Christmas Eve and be in the same scenario. So if you guys would give that some thought, I would appreciate it.
Holiday pay is basically a gift to employees. We don't have legal requirement to pay holiday pay. So that gives us, I mean, we can do it however we want to do it. So if we wanted to say holiday pay to be paid on either the observed date or the designated date at the discretion of the town manager, we could do that.
And yeah, and that's, you know, we list in the policy what days are observed holidays and how they would get paid. Now, like I said, I'll have to go back and look and see if we, it seems like we did address that in that public safety would, their holiday pay and overtime and all that was based on the actual holiday. Because otherwise, you could have somebody working on Friday, which isn't Christmas Eve, and make overtime, and then the guy that actually has to work Christmas Eve doesn't. So
Yeah.
anyway, we can look at that. But again, the main thing for
That
me
seems
was
like
just
a minor.
I'm sorry.
That just seems like a minor tweak to me.
Yeah.
You know, that we do it with the intention of being as employee friendly as possible on that, not to, you know, cheat anybody out of anything, but rather to make sure that we're taking care of employees when they are required to come in and do something at an unfavorable time, where we're pulling them away from their families on a holiday. That's important to treat them kindly.
Yeah, whether it's, you know, in the holiday section or, you know, in the call out section or something, just a statement that if they're called into work on an actual holiday, regardless of hours worked in the pay week, they'll get time and a half. But I think you're right. It's a relatively easy fix, but it definitely needs to be there because it's just something that's not addressed, and I think it's just right. And a lot of these things again are so. I guess ultimately they could add up to more than a little, but in the whole scheme of things, it's relatively small price tag that I think will make a difference for the employees. Okay. Well, I think that gets us a good start. We'll have some things to work on. And again, I appreciate you guys offering to send us language or keep tabs on the list of needed definitions or whatever. That's going to help a lot. So the things that we've covered and discussed, Sam and I will go back, and with anything you guys want to send us, then we'll craft some draft language to address those things, and we can start off the next meeting with revisiting those, and then move into the next section or two. If that sounds okay with everybody. Joe, have you got anything else?
No, I don't have anything else. Anybody else have anything? Nope.
All right, I don't, and we will. Look here. I've got May 4th as the next meeting, and we will this down. We'll try to have any of the draft language we can pull together to you guys at least that a week ahead of that.
Thank you.
All right, I really appreciate you guys' time and input. It's very helpful. And hopefully we have been in contact with Burris Thompson. They are starting work. They're looking at early to mid-May to have something back to us. I doubt we'll have it for the next meeting, but if by chance we do, I'll let you guys know. Otherwise, with a tight timeline, I may see if you guys are willing to get together again later in May ahead of meeting with council to go over all that. Okay. All right, that's all I have.
Do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Everybody agree?
I think that is the only vote we don't have to take a roll call on.
Okay, very good.
Very great. That's what I thought. So we're adjourned.
You guys have
Everybody
a
have a
good
great
night.
night.
Thank you.